Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Monday March 22nd Council meeting. And I'm present. Councilman absent. Councilwoman Anthony absent. Councilman Espino
present.
Senior Deputy Majority Leader Gonzalez absent. Councilwoman Grace here. Deputy Majority
Present.
Leader Harris. Councilwoman Peterson here. Present. Council President Pro Tem Charo.
Present.
Councilor Roya absent. Councilwoman Ryan absent. Majority Leader Sampson.
Present.
Majority Leader Taylor absent. Councilwoman Vargas present. Councilman Vargas absent. You have 8 present, 7 absent. You have we have 37. We have Tina Brown, our city council policy director here. And Everett today, council office, thank you. And I want to welcome these folks to the Yellow Youngs. Thanks for joining us in our policy office and Sean Sharp, just joined us. So we called today to be able to get a presentation. We have some skills community leaders here with us tonight to just start a conversation that we're going to need to keep happening throughout the winter about resources available, about getting an understanding of the homeless and unhoused population in Providence, especially as the end of winter services start. So we have with us Caitlin Primary, who's the executive director of Rhode and is there a preference of where you want to sit or stand? Is a great question for our.
I don't know yet if it's better. I don't mind standing, but I don't want to mess with tech.
No, standing's fine.
Yeah. All right, there we go. Look at that. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. So as thank you, Council President Miller and everybody else here on the council. As mentioned, I am the executive director of the Rhode Coalition and Homelessness. And I actually am familiar with the urban community. I used to be a development partner many years ago on the land Harris, and I'm a former resident of the city. So it's nice to be back, and I'm happy to talk about homelessness, talk a little bit about what that looks like in Providence, and really just be here to answer questions. One of the things you'll notice, the packet's pretty dense. There's a lot in there. I'm not going to go through everything today. I'd like to give people an opportunity to look at the data and kind of have an intro, but go back to some of the specifics that they might want to understand more. So without necessarily knowing what specifically we wanted to focus on, I'm giving you a pretty robust presentation that I can kind of highlight based on the conversation we're going to have tonight about what's most useful. And one piece I'll also just kind of highlight when it comes to homelessness is Rhode is a fairly small state. So a lot of the data that I'm going to talk about today really is Rhode Island wide. We do have some Providence specific, and I'll go into that. And we're starting to get more understanding of the locations, but I think as many people could imagine, when you're homelessness, it's transitional. Life is always happening. So it is sometimes somebody's in Providence, sometimes somebody's in East Providence. There's a lot of movement around. So I just want to keep that in mind as we're thinking about who experiences homelessness in Rhode Island, because it is a bit of a And I changes based on people's needs and what's going on. So I always like to start with why homelessness happens, and for some of you, this may be redundant. This is something you might already understand or experience, but I always like to level set. And homelessness really happens because of the cost of housing and how that relates to what we all make. So an average 2-bedroom in Rhode Island is going to cost about $1,700 a month. And you would need to make $70,000 a year in order to afford that, right? So it does not take an economist to kind of surmise that that math isn't that great. And a lot of people in Rhode Island are not making $70,000 that would be needed to afford that. And based on the out of reach report from 2022, you would need to work roughly 79 weekly hours at minimum wage. This was the old minimum wage that just increased to afford a 2-bedroom. So again, show me who has the amount of time in their week to work 79 hours. I mean, I'm a single mom. I don't know that I can do that. And then just come back to that. Sorry. The other piece I want to point out is it's not only that the minimum wage is really far out of what people need to earn in order to afford housing in the state, it's the rent rate. So average renters hourly wage is about $18 an hour. So it's not even like that we're really close with the average renter. It's just this huge gap. So the hourly rate would be 34. I mean, people aren't making that. It's a small privilege. And then when we look at people experiencing homelessness, we see that their income is even lower. So we have about 46% of people who enter shelter transitional housing that make no income whatsoever. And then the next biggest bucket is about 25% that make between $6,000 and $12,000 a year. Just think a minute, those of you that have families, what it would be like to try to manage a household on $8,000 a year. And then when we look at people living outdoors, it's a similar setting where we just have a large number of people that have absolutely no income whatsoever. And when we look at this over time, comparing prior years, you think that we see the income increase because every year cost of living increases, wages theoretically are going up. That's not the case. What we're seeing over time is actually the number of people with no income increasing. And then the buckets that kind of exist lower are also not getting bigger. So the ones that are growing are like the no income. Everybody else is seeing their incomes decline. So I talked a little bit about what Rhode Islanders are making that experience homelessness. So you made about $8,000 a year. You would need your rent to be $200 a month. I don't know that you could even really rent a storage unit. Some sizes for that. So there's just no apartments that exist for somebody to at $200. It just does not exist unless it's affordable housing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in homelessness. I'm going to talk about the state first and then get a little bit more specific into Providence. So each year we do a count, point in time count each January. We're currently tabulating January's numbers from this year. But we have them from prior years, and that tells us that there are about 1,500 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in Providence. And of those 1,500, about 250 are those people that are living outdoors. And the way that we do this count is through data in our database. So in Rhode Island, we have what's called the Homeless Management Information System. So all the shelters, the coordinated entry system, which is the help center hotline for seeking housing and shelter. All of the data kind of goes into this database, and that's how we're able to give the data that we have today. And then this is showing you the trend over time. So what you're seeing overall is the numbers have ticked up since the pandemic. We're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in emergency shelter, and that's because they've made more shelter beds available as homelessness has increased. And then we're also seeing a pretty drastic increase in unsheltered homelessness. That's that red line at the bottom. So it used to be, if we think 2019, that was 71 people. In 2022, that was 248. So it's just increasing dramatically. And then this is kind of homelessness right now. So this is giving you roughly 900 people in shelter plus 388 people living outdoors. And this would be as of kind of the last, that unsheltered number would be the last 2 weeks. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this number does not include the domestic violence program. So that prior slide would have included domestic violence, and there's one shelter in the state that doesn't really participate in HMIS, Providence Rescue Mission. That also would be in the last slide, not in this one. So we're not really seeing a decrease of anything we're seeing.
So why don't they participate?
They're entirely privately funded, and just have decided not to. They participate in point in time kind of every year though. And we would love to have them in the database, but I think because they're private and are religiously affiliated, that they just have decided to do their own thing. But we're grateful for the beds that they provide in the system, certainly. This is also a chart that gives you a sense of the housing inventory. And housing inventory can mean both like housing that we're trying to provide people experiencing homelessness so that they're able to get off the street out of shelter, and also shelter, so crisis. And this is just giving you a sense of how some of our emergency shelter, some of those resources have been available, but we're not necessarily seeing the increase across the board that we need. And then roughly we have 946 shelter beds in Rhode Island, and this gives you a sense of the type. This does not include properties that are warming stations or warming centers. So just specifying that the Cranston Armory would not be included in this. So when we talk about seasonal overflow, those are other expansions of diocese. Emmanuel House has overflow beds in their property that are considered a homeless shelter. And then this gives you a sense of the shelter beds in Providence. So you have majority of year-round beds and just a small number of overflow, and they're mostly beds for individuals and couples. And then when we talk about beds, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the money happens, because I think when we want to address housing and homelessness, it's really about how do we best utilize the resources and understand where the gap is so that we can advocate for more. So obviously, from a federal perspective, Congress appropriates money to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's kind of our overlord in homeless space that is propagating our regulations and our funding. And then there are 2 main buckets for money within the federal system. There's the Emergency Solutions Grant, which mostly focuses on shelter and crisis funding. And the city of Providence is actually the recipient of that. And I'm sure you've seen proposals under the budget come through here for those programming. And then there is the continuum of care, and think of the continuum of care, or COC, as kind of a planning body for the state on homelessness. So HUD requires communities to have that planning body, and then they will collaboratively submit applications to HUD for money, and the continuum of care money is funding that is primarily focused on affordable housing. And I know some people saw in the news that there was Senator Rhode announcing roughly 11 million. So we're so happy to have that money, but 10.4 million of it is renewals. So that is not new money, it's renewing programs that already exist. There was about $1 million in new projects that was funded, which is great. But when we think about the larger system, the bulk of that money is keeping people housed that were already funded. And like I said, that primarily funds rental assistance, permanent supportive housing. And for those of you that might not know, permanent supportive housing is an intervention where we take people who may have been chronically homeless, put them in housing with supportive services. So it's a very intensive supported program that works better for people who may have been homeless a long time and have a disability. So that's really our kind of silver bullet when we look at chronic long-term homelessness. And then from a state level, there is some state investment in shelters and affordable housing. That primarily goes through, at least on the homeless side, the Department of Housing and State under the Consolidated Homeless Fund. And then there's also Housing Resource Commission funds, which is funded by a real estate conveyance tax. That's the one you might remember in the previous legislative cycle that they increased the real estate conveyance tax on some commercial properties that now will be utilized for more affordable housing development. One thing I'll say about affordable housing money is that, you know, as you saw in earlier slides, people experiencing homelessness are extremely low. So what you need to do is when you're building housing, affordable housing, make sure that you are subsidizing it and developing it in a way that it's going to be affordable, because you've got to put more money in to make it affordable for them at $200. So that's something where ensuring that the investments in affordable housing are not only supporting workforce housing, different populations, elderly, but also really extremely low income. So why has unsheltered homelessness increased so dramatically? So you can see there's points. This is our 2-week number, which we find is our best number. Over the last several years, we've seen it as high as 500. We've seen it as low as kind of 160, but certainly haven't seen 160 since 2021. And again, this is a statewide number, but we do have certainly a large number that live in Providence specifically. So unsheltered homelessness occurs for a couple of different reasons. You have so little housing stock, such high costs, people cannot double up or couch surf. I think most of us probably know what couch surfing is. It's just, yeah. You can only do that for so long, particularly if the household that you're trying to stay with is in subsidized housing themselves. So when there's so many people disproportionately able to access housing, inherently will push some people outside. And that's what you've seen in the West Coast as well. You'll also see that some people have struggles with disabilities, mental health issues, substance use. It's actually a fairly small percentage of the population. I have some slides later on that are going to tell you the data on that. But in Rhode Island, you know, show me someone experiencing homelessness and I will show you a system that has failed that person. So if we were in Massachusetts, for instance, there's a Department of Mental Health that has a very robust supported housing program for people with severe and persistent mental illness, where they're not ever entering the homeless system because the MH in Mass says, okay, you have psychosis, you think the overhead wires are transmitting, you know, alien messages. You need help in staying housed and well. So here we're going to give you an apartment with supportive services, and it's entirely the Department of Health mental health program that's partners with community development and housing in Massachusetts. But the mental health community there has said, you know, we need to support these individuals. Same thing, you know, it's hard to get into developmentally disabled group home in the state. The only way to really get in is to be downgraded from a forensic unit or inpatient site. So there's a lot of systems in Rhode Island. We don't have halfway houses. You get discharged from ECI right out to the street. So there's both this lack of housing and also really challenging systems that are not supporting people. And what that results in is more people becoming homeless, and then you kind of get sucked into it because you are not able to give an address on an employment application. You are spending your day trying to figure out where you're going to eat, how you're going to survive, and it gets really hard to pull yourself out of that. Oh, and we'll just go back actually. Sorry. So these are a couple of other things that I just like people to understand about people, you know, in sheltered homelessness. Nobody wants to do it. They don't want to live outside. If they had housing, they may not want to go to shelter, but most people, if they had an apartment or housing, they would go. Unsheltered homelessness is dynamic and ever changing. Our data on unsheltered homelessness comes from firsthand accounts and is confirmed by outreach workers. We have metadata in all of our data entry, as well as we record our phone calls in our hotline for quality assurance. So, you know, we are fairly confident in our data. The last thing I want to mention is we also have an underreport of families experiencing homelessness because they think they call, we're going to take their kids away. And one thing I always want to make very clear is that just experiencing homelessness is being poor is not a reason to have your children taken away. You are under state law only really considered neglect or abuse if, let's say, someone is offered shelter or offered housing or offered support, and they're saying, no, I don't want that. That's when an investigation gets launched. So we're always trying to help people understand that, because we don't want that family to be staying in a car if we theoretically could get them in, but we don't know about them. And what I referenced was our coordinated entry system. This is a help center. We operate 365 days a year until 7 p.m. each night. And this is where, when your constituents are in need of help, this is who they call. But I'll say, and I think you guys as city council members all understand, I feel like I'm running a 911 dispatch without enough fire trucks or ambulances. So imagine your house is on fire, you call 911, 911 says, well, I have 30 other fires ahead of you. So I'm going to put you on a wait list for a fire truck to come put your fire out, because there are bigger, worse fires. And a month from now, I'll be able to put out your fire. So that's really what it feels like for us and running this help center, is that, you know, we have these agents that are answering calls, you know, every single day, but we don't have enough places to refer people. And at the end of the day, I don't want to refer people to shelter. We want to refer them to house, but there's just not enough of all of it. And we get about 4 monthly, about 5,000 calls. Highest is usually in January, where it's just shy of 8,500. And this is some of the stuff where I'm going to start kind of skimming over a little bit, but this just gives a sense of how people engage with the coordinated entry system. They're assessed, prioritized. It's a dynamic prioritization. So we're trying to refer people to shelter that are most likely to die on the streets. Again, I would love to put out everybody's fire, but when you don't have enough resources, you have to make some really difficult choices. And this is where we start to get into some Providence specific information. So we looked at the month of February, anybody that interacted with coordinated entry. So what you can see is we had about 1,400 individuals, 1,400 households that were in Providence over the month of February. This could be people that called, got referred to shelter, people that called that are waiting for shelter. Could be people that are applying for housing that are currently in shelter. So you can see that Providence is the largest number within the state. And this is just giving you a sense of the calls over time. And we have, at any given time, I used my medical earlier in the 911 dispatch. So this is giving you a sense of how many people living outside we have waiting for shelter. And this says last week. I believe that this is actually the last week in February. So there is a misnomer on this presentation that it says that as of this week, but it was last week, but it would have been when this data was prepared, which was at the end of February. So I can send an annotated version that corrects that. But again, it's still a large number of individuals that are unsheltered waiting for some sort of intervention. And there's always a gap between what we can provide. So for example, this is supply and demand for single adults and couples. So, you know, we'll have 275 people waiting. I have 23 beds in, if this is by month. Yeah. So some nights we might have 2 or 3 beds of them to then for hundreds of people that are waiting for that bed. And then it's even more challenging with families, because families seem to stay longer in shelter, and we have fewer of the family shelters in the state. I'm gonna kind of move through some of this. This gives you a sense of where people were coming into prior to homelessness, how long they're staying. And one thing that is important to keep in mind is it's a system like any other system. People were having shorter stays in shelter. We could be getting more people into shelter, but because they're not leaving and going to housing, whole thing is backed up, right? So we look at places like the Armory, other locations. If people were quickly getting out the back door into housing, we wouldn't have this issue at the front door. And this just gives you a sense of where people are exiting by the different types of projects. Again, you can skip ahead. And then this just gives some demographics. People experiencing homelessness are really throughout the different ages. You'll see that there's a decline, particularly among people living outside of age, and that's because on average, people experiencing homelessness die around 50 years. So they're dying 20 years sooner than the general population. So we don't see as many elderly people experiencing homelessness because they don't live long enough. And that's trauma homelessness, that's healthcare, that's other issues that are part of experiencing poverty. But you also see we have a lot of kids too. This is giving you a sense of, the next slide is health conditions. So I think a lot of people would think that this 42% number was substance use, and it's not, it's mental health. And think about mental health as not everybody has a severe and persistent mental illness. It's actually historically among states, actually a fairly small population that has really severe mental health needs. This is anxiety, this is depression, this is an adjustment disorder because you're experiencing homelessness. PTSD is really huge for this population. You think about people who have experienced domestic violence, who are refugees. So really the majority of people experiencing homelessness, and it's not even the majority because it's not even 50%. We've got a lot of people that have a chronic health condition, but we're really only seeing 5 or 7% of people with a substance use or drug use disorder. So the majority of people experiencing homelessness don't suffer from these conditions. Again, you may think of them as this because maybe they're the individuals that are more invisible, but really there but for the grace of God goes so many of us in a lot of ways. You're just kind of one paycheck behind, potentially away from homelessness. This is for people that are currently living outdoors. So I did want to give this, so you certainly do see more alcohol and drug use disorders with people living outdoors, but it's still not everybody. And again, the prevailing issue seems to be mental health. So I know a lot of people will self-medicate too, if they have untreated mental health issues. So it's really, in some ways, it's a housing crisis, but it's also a healthcare crisis. And then I always like to talk about chronic homelessness because again, when I ask individuals to think of who experiences homelessness, they think of, older male, the 60s, maybe it's a white male handmaiden. That's kind of a lot of time who I get thought of, but it's not. I mean, only 16% of the state's homeless population is chronically homeless. The vast majority of people have just hit a bad mental luck and cannot afford the housing we have in our state. And then we also have a lot of racism and disparate outcomes based on race ethnicity. So this is a single adults and couples. So you can see that, for example, Black persons make up roughly 9% of the state, but are 23% of the single adults living in emergency shelter, transitional housing, right? So something is happening here that we have such a large portion of BIPOC individuals in homeless or unsheltered setting. Why aren't they getting access to income? Why aren't they getting access to housing? And I think we all know that history. And then families is even more upsetting. So again, Black persons, roughly 9% of the state, 30% of our families living in emergency shelter. It's a third. It's also a really large number too. 22% of our families living outside. Yeah, that's families, that's right. Yeah. And then we also see for individuals, ethnicity is fairly proportional to in terms of Hispanic, Latinx, but when we look at families, it is less proportional. So again, Hispanic, Latinx makes roughly 70% of the population, just shy of 40% of our families in emergency shelter. And again, it's no better for those living outside. And it's also families living outside. So my last slide is really about how do we address the crisis. These are recommendations I've made. Most places we go, flexible resources, treat this as a crisis that it is, The State Department of Housing needs to be as robust as possible to make sure that the money and the resources in the sport are flowing to municipalities. We also need to deal with the system failures that exist at the state level, and in interagency council with the department heads, you need to get PHGH and corrections and everybody together at the table. And really utilizing housing as a healthcare, and by housing people, you can actually save money. We find on average that you can save anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 per person. You know, you're not spending it on rescue runs, you're not spending it on ED visits. So really, housing both is better for people and it saves money, but it's a lot of getting all the systems in play to work together. So I would love questions, and I know there are specific thoughts around armoring too. So I would just love for anyone to share any reactions.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And also when you get here, it's in here and doesn't I don't know if any you or you want to either to council that's really very extra welcome to.
Would you like me to take a seat?
Anything's fine.
I can stand just because I can see you. If I stand, this is I don't know.
Or we can bring you a chair if you sort of come home.
Just now my toes.
So, yes. Okay, thank you for that presentation, and thank you for allowing us to understand the system a little better. I guess around the system, I still have questions, and
It's complicated.
It's really complicated, something like it is, but I felt like I need to study this even more. You said that, who puts it down in?
Each of the shelters and providers in the state with data, as well as the street average. So it's a database that's web-based. We use BitFocus, which is a Clarity product that LA, Las Vegas, a bunch of other municipalities want to utilize.
And the data is used for reporting to the federal government?
It is used for any number of things. It is used as a record for the client in terms of their accessing services, because you actually have to prove your chronic homelessness. So there's data that's used, you know, think about you go to the doctor's office, you've got your record of where you've been and what's going on. It's used as case management tools for the provider, so they can, you know, track, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing as a provider? It is used for state and federal reporting. The majority of the reporting, if not all of it, is all aggregate. So the information that's kept in there in terms of like names, security numbers, that's all kept privately and secure. I'm not reporting that to the federal government. So what gets reported to the feds is, you know, how many homeless people on a given night, like a total number. It's not the who, not the who specifically.
Now, that is the recording system. Between the put the data in, somebody calls up and they need a slip. How does those services get to the people? Like right now, this is just county, right? It's county.
This is the whole state of Rhode.
Yeah, but we're counting people who are homeless.
Right.
And then once they file, I'd say they call up and they're homeless. How do they get the service? I mean, I understand it's recorded and
so we'll take that information about kind of what's going on with their crisis. If we can refer them to somewhere else, we will. So some people may not yet have been evicted, and so maybe it's legal services or something else. So we will try to send them where is appropriate. If it's domestic violence situation, we might send them to the DV hotline, domestic violence hotline. But in general, if we take that information, it goes into the database, they're added to the list. They tell us where they'd like to go. So we have, for example, if you're a family, you know, roughly 4 family shelters in the state. My guess is a family in Providence probably not going to go to Newport. So we will literally ask them, like, would you go? So then when we have an availability of a bed come up, I'm not going to call them for a bed in Newport because I already know that mom is so desperate she's willing to go to Newport, or is like, no, you know, I'm doubled up with family, like I can make it work until 1 in Providence is available. So, but the challenge is it feels really frustrating to the callers because we're taking in their information, they're on a list, but then particularly for families, there's almost no. So it can take 30 days or longer to get a shelter bed. And that's just because there's not enough resources. So that's where I said it feels like we are a 911 system that just doesn't, doesn't have enough fire trucks.
One more Councilwoman, I'm just trying to.
I love that.
Understand this.
And I will say they have to call back every 30 days to stay on.
Okay.
So we are scrubbing the list, and then if we call and offer someone a bed and they're like, oh no, we figured it out, they're off the list, then definitely. We update the field.
And you're saying when I call, I can directly speak to a human being instead of that, probably that they call back every now and then.
Yeah, I mean, we do, you call, you select some buttons so that we can best route you, and part of that is for language too, to make sure that we're being inclusive of all languages. And then usually there's maybe a wait, so that's where you'll put in your number and we'll call you back. But most of our and I can bring for future meeting our like statistics on the call center and callback time and all of that sort of stuff that's we can track. But I think, the longest somebody may have a callback is 20-30 minutes. But again, when we're getting thousands of calls a week, and in particular, people get frustrated if there's no movement too. So those are extra calls. Like it's a much simpler process. And we have John Smith presents. John Smith has a shelter bed. Let's connect you. Right. That is not what we generally have. It's a lot of helping them understand the system, refer, trying to be trauma informed.
You have a lot of people working in that.
Yeah, we have about 10 plus agents. Yeah. And they're per diem, some full time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Councilman Grace, you.
I don't have really much of a question, Caitlin. I just want to thank you for the work that are doing and currently doing. That was really tough. I work in constituent services in the state house.
You yeah.
How it is. It's impressive to be honest. It's hard to continue this work, but it's important that we reach to different community agencies, community partners, different branches of government, to keep the fight moving forward. My only question is in regards to the graphs about the health condition that projects entry. So I mean, we all know there's like the conception of like most homeless people are there because they use alcohol or drugs. But I mean, my understanding like addiction is a disease. So I mean, any opportunity that I get to change the narrative, I take advantage to do it. But my question is, when we're counseling someone as like alcohol use disorder, would it like where are we categorizing them under that instead of like, no, they are addicted to alcohol, it should be a chronic health condition? Where is the separation there?
Yeah, so it's a great question. That particular classifications are HUD classifications. So because these are all HUD programs, they in their infinite wisdom give us data dictionaries that tell us what terminology we can use. I mean, I would absolutely classify, particularly depending on the individual person, those can absolutely be chronic health conditions. So yes, I would say that alcohol substance use would 100% fall into that. But for the purposes of HUD and the way the database is, they break it out. And I think for us, sometimes it's helpful to just challenge that stigma too. Because if we do lump it all together, they're gonna think, oh, well, the chronic health condition, it's all drugs, and it's not. It's diabetes is really big. We have a lot of COPD, a lot of emphysema. It's a really high percentage of cigarette smoking within the homeless population, and that just wears on your body in addition to the trauma and PTSD. So it's those other health conditions that kind of fall under the chronic health. But I would absolutely agree with you.
Thank you for giving a data because before when I moved to from New York here, so I don't see it there. Yeah, I don't see all the people around or doing the whole thing. They have it, but it's not, you see. So now around the world, you see more people, for example, California, New York, and here, so I feel like I'm convinced, you know, like everybody going to see that more and more and more. So I don't know, it's not only this. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for giving the information, and we know how we can help to do this, you know, the better people will have a place, because everybody deserves have a place to live. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, and it really saves lives too. I mean, it is a life or death situation. We had a fireman in Providence, you know, recently. I think it's, you know, we wouldn't want our loved ones to be.
Thank you for the presentation. That's probably covered this or something else. So my understanding is that it's about 1,600 people are homeless in the state of Rhode.
On a given.
On a given day.
Yeah.
That's a 2022.
Yeah, and then I think I had showed the homelessness now is about 1,300, but that wasn't including. The reason I have to exclude domestic violence is they're in their own database for obvious reasons. So you would see probably a very similar number. We're tabulating our point in time count data. We'll have it probably within a couple of weeks. And we should have Providence specific information in that as well. But the sense I'm getting is it's growing.
So
But yeah, so 1,600 I would say is safe for tonight, correct?
and so since this post-COVID, during COVID, you say that this has impacted because of the COVID situation and so forth. Prior to that, what was the numbers of homelessness? Between, let's say,
Like 1,100, they're going, like, current shelter number on 3 years was 50. And it's 248 in 2022.
that's a credit. I wouldn't say credit to the state, and credit to
Right.
because certainly the Senate we tackled this, and at one point I can remember we were at almost 4,000 people.
Yeah, that would be our annual.
Conservation. So just to see that number of this kind of possible around. But knowing that the economy and the recession is coming, it may be a question right now, but the recession is coming, we can see the uptick correct as a couple of months, right? Things are going up and now it's coming up. So people may be evicted and also increase in the homelessness population.
100%.
The question is, in the city of Providence, how many out of those 1,600 is represented in just the numbers?
I mean, I think you have roughly, I think it's like 474 beds. I mean, my guess is you're probably 550, 600. Yeah, it's a good portion. We'll have it for the point in time. I'll be able to give you a better number, but just based on the data we had in February, I would say, yeah, because you've got close to 500 just in shelter beds alone. And if you're looking at people outside, it's another 100.
So along those lines, I see sort of a breakout in terms of the population, you know, white, black, and female, and civic population. Our communities outside of Providence and Kentucky and South, they're being outreached to and talked to in terms of how they can support people in their own in those communities. And with that said, as we are working with the homeless population, do the service providers, do they ask what community they come from, let's say, or state and so forth, just to know sort of the transition?
Yeah,
things?
we're tracking that now, so it's a newer data element for us in terms of location, and keep in mind somebody that like you could be on Cranston Street, like which side are you on, right? But in general, we get that when they call in, and then so it's basically in our assessment, and then we'll update it as things will change. But keep in mind, because it is fluid, there's not like a drone.
Right.
But yeah, we are tracking that, and in terms of other communities, so my plan, actually, you guys are the first, but my plan is basically do this presentation with any other council that will happen in the state. And realistically, other communities are having encampment issues as well, so West Warwick, there's a lot of it, Westerly, I mean, some of their communities are more rural, and if you were looking for a place to safely live outside, you're going to pick somewhere that's hard to find, hard to see, because that's going to give you the most security, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. So a lot of the rural communities, it's in state parks, it's in kind of forest, or just properties that aren't well kept and people can't like see back to the encampment. But we definitely have almost every community in the state has, certainly has people being evicted and facing housing insecurity, but we get we'll get calls from pretty much everywhere.
And the reason why I asked that is because during those times, we were seeing that on two levels. One, communities were resistant to accept the fact that people were having a.
Right, it's not just Providence, it's an everywhere problem.
Exactly what we're talking. So I think from a perspective of getting the information out there is that other communities need to step up to realize that the economic challenges are here and it's going to get worse, and especially in Rhode. The second question I had was in reference to veterans. So back then, as of now, a high number of veterans and families were unhoused and homeless, right? But pretty much. What numbers do this represent? I didn't see.
Yeah, the veterans are a fairly small number. I think when we did our point in time count 2022, I'd have to look, but I think it was under 100. I want to say it's in the 80s. So it's a small number. The challenge we have with veterans is it's going to depend on their classification of their veteran status. So they're honorably discharged, dishonorably discharged, what their discharge status and access. So there's a lot of, actually, VI has done a tremendous job in stepping up for resources. There's SSVF, which is a supportive service rental assistance program. There's VASH vouchers, kind of the Veterans Administration and the housing authorities. But if you are not VA service eligible, that's where it's really challenging. But it's a small, thankfully it is enough, that number is pretty consistent.
And then what else can we do to actually help the veterans and families at the local level? I'm sure my colleagues pretty much have probably extended them. Thank you for the information, because it's certainly at one point it was over 4,000.
Yeah, I think that was our annual number.
That's right. When I saw those, that's the sheet. It's the 600. Anyone that's homeless is done, right? But to see those numbers from both in the past decade, from like 4,000 to pretty much 1,500.
Well, and I want to say 4,000 with annual, 1,500 is 190. So I would say our annual number is probably closer to that. So I just want to make sure. Yeah. So that, because there's one point in time, it's just one night, 4,000 would have been everybody that was seen by that system in here. Yeah. So I just want to make, because we're good, but we're not that good. Yeah. So that's just the only thing I wanted. But I also just appreciate that you have that memory. Like I can tell that data touched you. You know what I mean? Yeah. Right.
We'll continue.
Yes, I appreciate that.
So thank you, everyone, whatever it is, thank you very much for your words. I'm humbled by the information that you're providing, because it just makes me think that there's not enough that we're doing, right? And you provided this beautiful slide that said, how do we address this? And these are all wonderful steps to do all this, but this is like, these are not needed. And for me, I guess my question is, what as counselors, as big counselors, what do we do immediately? Because these are things that take and take, a couple of steps here and there. What can we do to be supportive as soon as possible?
I love that question. Treat every Rhode Islander that's experiencing homelessness as just a human being. Show them kindness, ask them questions, and just challenge the assumptions. I think speaking to family and friends about the issue, because you mentioned a lot of these are really solutions and efforts that we need at the state level, and really how we affect change is it's being talked about in the media. We need to speak are doing a wonderful housing package, and that's because all of us are just done with what this is, right? Everybody's housing is too expensive. So I think having those conversations, and also just support the service providers that are doing the hard work. Like my staff just have to answer the phone calls, like Famous House, Crossroads, Better Lives Rhode Island. Like these are all nonprofits that are in this community, supporting people, you know, see what they need. That maybe it's money, maybe it's, you know, 401 gives is coming up. And then I would also say, you know, you've been a great community development director and over here, she would be happy, I'm sure, to talk to you. But, you know, look at how money is being allocated. You know, the city is a part of the partnership with the state, so they have some influence in state decisions. And, you know, we've even supported there's ARPA money and our medical respite programs. And I think you guys are actually doing a lot already and having the team that you have, but I think my biggest thing is just like treat people with grace and humanness and keep those conversations out in the public so that we can keep kind of collectively moving change. And I'd also say, you know, certainly feel free to volunteer at the coalition. I mean, we do a lot of stuff at the State House. I know that's also a new customer meeting. But if anybody's ever interested in, you know, volunteering, donating, serving on a board, serving on a host committee, I mean, we're really trying to raise the issue. And you know, there's that Desmond Tutu kind of allegory of like, you know, you want to pull the drowning babies from the river, but you also want to go upstream and stop. And we're all the ones that get to go upstream and stop people from drowning babies in the water that they're going.
Only one thing, I don't know if I speak normally. But before I was in working with the farming, I had to, you know, other people. And I feel frustrated when people say, I need help, and I can only give you the information or give you the phone, and you have to continue to do it. And the kids sometimes say, Mom, I want to go back home. We don't have home. We have to wait for none of them. So it's very potential. The kid have to do, for example, you know, soccer, they have to go to the school, but if I probably see like everywhere, so it's very difficult. You say, what can you do for these people? What can I do? I don't have any home. I don't have anybody. So when they give me the phone number to contact the person, the right person, the right information. So what they give me the real information. And for me, I said, I can do it. I can do it because I get crying because people don't have their home. And they especially children don't have a home to go. And then the kids, you know, their own space and find them out of space.
I mean, I'll say I'm actually a foster mother, and my prior placement was in a family foster, community foster placement. Got placed with me because the housing was Providence housing, didn't meet the codes. So that family, that child was removed from her family, like not removed from parents, but was with family, right? Which is the goal. Only reason that made her was because he didn't pass infection. So like it is, that's the sort of stuff that drives me, and it's probably more. But yeah, I would definitely say, you know, call, you know, you've got the information in the hotline here, we have it on our website. And we also will do texting chat, we have a language line, which means if we basically any conceivable language we can generally do. And we just need to keep fighting and fighting. And I will say lastly, that housing really is a silver bullet. Like there's any number of issues that come before, wonderful, you know, council members and from education to police to, you know, any of those things, and really housing's the base foundation piece. If you don't have that covered, you're not going to be able to work and successfully engage in the community. You're not going to be able to enjoy the park as a park, because the park is a place you're living, right? But there's all these pieces. You're not going to do well in school. You're not going to do well in this. So it's really the thing that can kind of make everything else come into place. And I think there's a lot that the city council can consider in terms of just how to make more affordable housing available, different policies and stuff like that. And how to through, different legislative things to do within council.
Again, I'm just trying to,
You guys.
yeah, I'm just trying to understand, because I think there's a lot, HMIS,
Yes,
and then I hear, the CES, I mean, interest system.
yeah, so
What's the difference?
they think of CES as the hotline, right? And then HMS is the database that the hotline info goes in, along with the, you show up at a shelter and, you're checked in and you're in the database, or a street outreach worker has a tablet and taking down the information. So HMIS is the database, CES is the help center.
I have a burning. Yeah, I can't help but think about it. I was just like, this is really good and I need to.
I am here for it, yeah.
You said, and I understand the frustration. Trying to place people in houses that you just don't have, right? Or trying to place them in shelters. How do you prioritize? How do you, if you got only 4 available rooms, you got 20 people that call you within that hour.
So it's actually a community decision. So I mentioned earlier the continuum of care.
Okay.
That's the state planning body. So actually, ironically, CBS, we just enforce what we're given. So the continuum of care planning body has subcommittees, but ultimately it is a process where providers, constituents, other people get engaged, and we decide as a community what we feel the highest priority is, and that's a very tough conversation. It's changing and evolving too. And then the board actually votes on that, and I would imagine, I mean, they're always looking for continuum of care board members as well. So I would encourage many of you that might be interested. I know you have your plates full with this service, but that is another place to get involved, because it really is where some of the decisions are being made. But what we try to do, that continuum of care, is prioritize based on morbidity and mortality. So it usually looks at age and disability, and kind of how long you've been homeless, and it really pretty much always focuses on somebody who's unsheltered first. So if we have somebody that's kind of couch surfing, but is more okay than somebody who is literally outside. And then somebody who's a double amputee at 60, particularly when most people don't live past 50, that person is much more vulnerable than, say, a 20-year-old. But again, I serve them, we serve them. It's terrible. It's like choosing, it's just an impossible choice. But what it tries to be is based on who's most likely to die on the streets.
I did have more, but I think I've got me.
I will also happily do one-on-one meeting. Our offices are actually in Providence, a couple blocks away with the CIC. So I will come meet with anybody. I just really appreciate the work that you guys do, and just even giving it this much attention. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with this council too. I worked with the city for a long time, which is really good people. So I'm really grateful for your attention.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm just thank you for your time. I mean, any closing comments at all? Go back to the
Thanks again.
Yeah.
So this is extremely informative. So our next meeting should be solution based. A little bit needed, a little units to be built, cost. And then we just service around, putting the money, put this stuff together.
I'd be happy to come around there.
Yeah, this is a good one. Because I don't know, too many available units are $200 a month.
You probably could let me know, because I have some people.
A lot of people that made $70,000 a year, and it's all.
Yeah.
To get it done.
And it's just gonna keep going this way too. And we used to be maybe a little bit more expensive for a while, but we're just part of Boston at this point, we're really just getting fair market.
Thank you. Great.
Well, we have no further statement from us. And we're going to much more.
So.
We have a motion, second, all in favor? All right, thank you all so much.